Hi, thanks for joining this podcast at the Marketing Insights event 2022. My name is Sonja van den Berg. I'm client consultant at DVJ Insights. And I'm here today with Lucas Hulsebos, CEO of DVJ Insights. And the topic we would like to talk about today is attention. But before we do that, Lucas, what do you think of the Marketing Insights event so far?
Yeah, I think the Marketing Insight event, as every year, is a good mix of a lot of great stories and stories you already heard. So I think it's great to see a lot of people working in the same industry each year.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we all agree on that.
Feels a little bit like a reunion.
Yeah, I recognize that. So as said, back to the topic of today of attention. Recently, a couple of interesting articles were shared and broadly discussed on the topic of attention. Of course, by Byron Sharp and also Mark Ritson. And as you may have seen, it started with a lecture by Byron Sharp on the effectiveness of advertising. He claimed again the 2 golden rules of the Ehrenbas Bach Institute. That you have to reach everyone in the category, and that you have to spread your budget across time slots and across locations. But then an interesting question came from the crowd about attention, and things got more interesting and animated. And Sharp agreed with the statement that the job of advertising is to get some attention. And he also agreed that he doesn't want to do advertising and not be seen. But after that, paying for a lot more, no, he said. So I'm curious, Lucas, what do you think of the role of attention in advertising?
Yeah, I think it was an interesting discussion. And what you see a lot in advertising, if people talk about attention, it's all about the extension of reach. So you reach a certain amount of people, and from that amount of people, some people also pay attention. And that's, I think, a very limited view on what attention in advertising really means. Because I think it's much more than just seeing an ad. And if you describe it in the way Byron Sharp did, as just the number of people seeing an ad, then I can imagine that what he says makes sense. But I think he underestimates the importance and the role of attention significantly.
Mm-hmm. And you hear a lot nowadays that emotions are much more important than attention. What is your point of view?
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. So if you look at attention, so the number of people seeing an ad, but it's good to ask yourself the question, why do people see that? We all live in a world where advertising avoidance is default, is the norm. People try to avoid advertising as much as possible, and even people are willing to pay to avoid advertising. So in order to make sure that people see the ad and pay attention, you can also see attention as an emotion, and maybe even the strongest emotion. But before any other emotion can start, you first have to pay attention. And the willingness from people to pay attention is something that is really, really important and neglected a lot. Yeah. And I think that is exactly also what Mark Ritson pointed out. Attention is so much more than just seeing the ad. Attention is an emotion. And I think, based upon all the research that I've done over the past 25 years, I think that attention is probably the strongest emotion you have in advertising.
And then do you then think that attention gets enough attention in advertising?
No, not at all. Because we live in a world of forced exposure. Attention is given. So that already starts at the beginning, at the advertising agency, where people create ads and you show it to someone else to get an evaluation or to get a feedback, and that starts with attention. Attention is always forced, attention is always something that is given. Then you go to the advertiser to show the ads that has been developed, and people watch it from start to finish, which is not normal. And then you go into qualitative research, where you actually force people to watch it over and over again to understand what people think. And sometimes even in campaign validation, you do the same thing. So from the beginning of the process till the end, attention is totally neglected. And as I said before, it is the strongest emotion in advertising. And on top of that, if you don't see advertising, there's no processing at all. And the default is that people try to avoid it. So in general, I think attention is not at all have enough attention in advertising.
Yeah, and you are a CEO of a market research company of DVJ. How do you measure attention at DVJ?
Yeah, in order to answer that question, it's good to give some context on how advertising actually, or how attention can be measured. And what you see a lot in research is that you ask people to watch something from start to finish, and then ask if people pay attention the next time. I think that is maybe the worst possible method of measuring attention, and used a lot in all forms of advertising. It's the same as you actually watch something, the new ad that you have created, and then you watch it, and then you think, can people see that again? So that's that indirect way of measuring doesn't make sense and should actually be forbidden by law. But in general, there are a lot of direct measurements. So that means that you show something and then you register or passively measure if people pay attention or not. And that, in general, are the best possible methods. And what we do within DVJ, we try to replicate every environment. Because attention is also influenced heavily by the channel or the environment that you're actually using. So attention in a cinema is something completely different than attention on the front page of a newspaper or in a social environment. So the first thing you have to do is take into account the environment where people actually see the ad and place it in its natural environment. The second thing, which is evenly important, is that people can act in the same way as they would normally do. So if you watch television, you can zap away. If you go through a magazine, you can page through the next page. And if you're in a cinema, you can actually go away. But that is much more, or that takes much more effort than the effort of not watching anymore, scrolling through the next page in a website. So that natural behavior in combination with that natural environment, those are the two elements that you have to take into account. And within DVJ, we combine that and we made it a passive measurement system that is adjusted for each channel. And there we register exactly what people see and, more importantly, what people miss.
Okay, what do you think are challenges in measuring attention?
Yeah, as I said, so in order to replicate an environment, you need some technical solutions for that. And those are in general, they become more and more easy, but that was always in the past a big problem. And the second thing is you have to understand the combination of exposure and behavior. And what you sometimes see in research is that companies are able to replicate the environment, but not the behavior. And I think the combination of a good environment and natural behavior, finding that perfect mix, that's the biggest challenge. And on top of that, if you then register it, you also need a reference. So you need to know, is it good or not? So people spend on average maybe 12 seconds on a TV ad. Well, is that good? Or is 12 seconds way too low? So it's always important to have a reference as well. So the combination of the placement, the behavior and the reference, that makes it even harder. And if you have a reference, you can put it in perspective, compare it, see if it's good or not, and then do something with it.
Okay. We have a lot of marketeers listening to this podcast. What do they need to do when their ads do not get enough attention?
Yeah.
What would you advise them?
To start all over again. No, and I think the challenge is, how do you actually generate attention? And I wish I had the golden formula. As I said, I'm already working on attention for more than 20 years. I looked at how people use their eyes. I've done a lot of registration of behavior, and I always interested in finding the perfect mix. How do you create the ad that always generates attention? But the problem is, the moment you know that, the next time it doesn't work anymore. So generating attention is a creative process. Creativity is what drives it. It's very hard to predict. It's very good to measure. And I think if you don't have enough attention, there's not a lot of things that you can do. So then you have to focus on the tactics of advertising, which means that you have to maximize the loss in attention and to avoid that people miss your brand and your message. So that means that if you don't get enough attention, then a lot of advertising tricks are used. Put the logo on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a trick. Sometimes it works. In most cases it does not. But it's all to avoid or to use that loss of attention. So if your ad or your concept doesn't get enough attention, try to maximize the execution. Use all the tricks that are out there to make sure that at least people understand who the brand was and what the message was. But the best thing is to generate attention and to let that happen by itself. But that's also the most difficult part, and only a couple of ads are able to do that. And I think that's also the reason why a lot of advertising is simply not good enough and doesn't create any impact.
And what, in your opinion and experience, are the main reasons for less attention to an ad?
Yeah, that's a good question. And everyone is actually looking for understanding that. But I think there are three main reasons why people don't pay enough attention. And also when I looked at a lot of the meta-analysis that we've done by using thousands and thousands of ads, the most important reason why people don't watch or why you don't get enough attention is dislike. People simply do not like what they see. It's not important who the brand is or what the message is or whether it's relevant for you, but dislike is probably the strongest reason for not paying attention. Secondly, and in most cases also something that is really neglected, is recognition. So you have seen something that you maybe liked the first time, but the second time you see it, you pay less attention. The third time, even less. And that works different for each media. So in certain media, loss of attention is very direct, and recognition leads to loss in attention, which is very direct. Or in other media, recognition leads to another way of looking at things. But those two elements, so dislike and recognition, they explain 80% of the different reasons for not paying attention. And relevancy is probably the third one. But that's something that people think is a very important reason. As if we can only pay attention to the things that are relevant for us. But in order to make that judgment or make that call where it's relevant, you first have to pay attention. That doesn't come automatically.
Yeah.
So relevancy is in most cases not a very important reason for people not paying attention to advertising.
Very interesting to hear. And do you see many differences between channels?
Yes, a lot. And that's also something you can imagine. So if you are sitting in a cinema, then you basically have nothing else to do than watch the ad that is played before you actually see the movie. But if your ad is part of the front page of a newspaper, or your ad is part of a social environment, the channel itself and the medium that you selected also drives attention in a lot of cases. And that also has a very big impact on how you create ads. So if you create a cinema ad, you can be a little bit more patient with bringing your brand and message. If you have a social ad where you know that people in general only pay 2 or 3 seconds, or out-of-home advertising where people only pay attention for 1 or 2 seconds, you have to create something else. So a video that you use in social can never be the same as a video you use in the cinema. So in order to take into account the level of attention people pay, simply because of every channel has its own way of paying attention, that's already a very important thing to keep in mind when you create advertising. So you just said all the people that are listening, advertisers, advertising agencies, researchers, the first thing you should do is, what is the channel that you're looking for? What's the channel that you're using? Because every channel has its own attention generating power. And that's a very important driver for creating advertising. And also something that's very much forgotten because of that forced exposure route that you follow from the start. And so if you don't take into account the level of attention, it doesn't matter. So the level of attention is always the same. In forced exposure, the level of attention is always the same. In reality, it is not.
So, summarizing what you said, what would be your tips for advertisers and agencies?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of tips. First thing is what I just said. Before you create advertising, take into account the channel that you're using and the level of attention that it can generate. If you create a social ad, realize that you only have 2 or 3 seconds. If you have a cinema ad, take into account that you probably have 45 seconds to bring your message across, which leads to something completely different. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when your advertising agency presents ads to you, don't look at them completely. Try to understand. So for example, you have to evaluate a TV ad that is being created by an agency. Just look at it the first 10 seconds and then stop the video. And then think about what is actually the kind of information I now have. Did I like what I see? Is it already clear who it was? Is there some form of relevancy? Is there some form of interest already? But the first time you watch it, don't look at it completely. Also with out of home or print ads. The first time you see it, don't make a study out of it. Don't spend 30, 40 seconds looking at it with the entire story. Just ask your agency to show it to you for 1.5 seconds. And if you then know, hey, this was appealing, and then because you're part of the brand and you live the brand, it probably brings a lot of recognition already. Therefore, you have to limit the first time or limit the time that you see an ad the first time, and then see it from a consumer's eye. And I think that is the combination of take into account the channel, and when you evaluate it, look at it first, not from start to finish, but shorter than that. That will help you already select a lot of bad advertising from what you have seen.
I would be curious to know how many people are already doing this, how many marketeers?
Well, I think that is not happens a lot because in general, what I just said, it's the forced exposure idea. And also, if you look at it from a perspective of an advertising agency, it is much easier to first tell the story, then tell the joke which in there of the emotion that you put in it, and then show it, because then you're prepared. What I sometimes do if I talk about attention and I have to present at bigger audiences, I show a video of where people throw a basketball to each other. And in that video, a gorilla enters the screen. And if you just look at it, you probably see the gorilla. If you ask people to count the number of times that people catch the ball, you don't see the gorilla. And if you say before the video starts, there is a gorilla in it, everyone sees it. So that's also how it goes with attention. Most consumers count the ball and miss the gorilla. And so I think that's a very important lesson. People don't look at it the way you expect them to do. And that video of that gorilla is a perfect example how important attention can be. Because imagine what it means for your message, the level of investments that you have. And the gorilla is your brand, the gorilla is your message. And people miss it simply because you did not take into account the lessons from paying attention. And I think that's a very important thing to take into consideration.
And do you also have tips for other research agencies?
Well, I think that in general, attention is neglected a lot, especially in qualitative research. I don't think it is a good idea to test advertising or advertising material qualitatively, because it's so far away from what people do in normal life that you can have an ad that looks good on paper, but in reality it doesn't perform at all. So I think that also advertisers, but so besides advertisers, also research agencies should pay much more attention to attention. And not only as an extension of reach, but as an emotion that drives the success and impact of advertising.
And then back to the discussion, what we started our podcast with between Byron Sharp and Mark Ritson. In your opinion, who was right?
Yeah, it was. For me, it's a very easy answer because I think what Byron Sharp actually said doesn't make sense at all. For me, that was complete nonsense, and that's also how Mark Ritson described that phenomenon. And he even uses stronger words than I just used. So I think Mark Ritson was definitely right. Mark Ritson actually pointed out the importance of attention and the way that it should be part of every process where people create advertising, evaluate advertising, and place advertising.
Very clear story, Lucas. Thank you very much for your time and for your lessons, I would say. And enjoy the rest of the me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.